Welcome to the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast, a show dedicated to modern learning and development. With your hosts, Daniel Mendonca and Scott Babcock.
It's podcast day. Welcome to the show. This is If You Build It, Will They Learn? I'm Scott Babcock. With me is your co-host, Daniel Mendonca. Daniel, it is great to be back on the air with you. How have you been over the last couple of weeks?
Doing pretty good. Feeling podcast refreshed. We took a quick break. I know you escaped to the wilderness. We'll talk about that later. Hope everybody's Memorial Day was good, and glad to be back.
Absolutely. It's excellent to be back. It feels a little bit more normal. Vacation's good, but it's good to be back in the seats, ready to roll. So we teased it for you a couple weeks ago. We promised it a week later, and then we took a break. That's our fault. But today's topic is moving your content online, a getting started guide. We are here today to talk about blended learning, and then more importantly, how do you kind of take those first steps to getting into the world of diversifying your content, getting it digital, getting it online, pulling away from just singular ways of getting in the classroom training out to your field and moving forward. So we want to take you through that process today and hopefully provide you some insights that let you take the next steps towards building a blended learning environment, kind of changing the culture in your organization. All right, we talk about it in every episode, I believe. We've spent a lot of time on it, but hopefully that just shows you how important this topic is. We're talking about identifying the objectives that brought you to the world of blended learning and content for your organization. So maybe it sounds like a bit of a broken record with us, but we think it's that important. So what is your business's need? What drove you to seeing the benefit to blended learning or taking your content online? And we want to help you try to see that your business's need is what needs to drive the decisions you're making on the content you're building. So last episode, we talked about 4 kind of key benefits that we see to blended learning. The first being financial. How does it impact your budget? Trying to reduce some of those costs. The second being greater access, just-in-time training, changing up some of those modalities to allow people to get information when they need it. We talked about a better experience, changing up the way people learn, giving them some variation in the way the content's delivered, possibly meeting them more where their preferences are. And then lastly is greater insights. Obviously, the more that lives in the digital space gives you more data to play with. So you're going to learn more about your content and be able to kind of better facilitate some of that and meet those needs. Daniel, what from those sort of, I guess, if you had to pick a favorite, maybe which one do you like the most, or which one do you think has the biggest impact?
Yeah, I feel like the one we hear has the biggest impact primarily is always financial. I think it's about reducing that dollar figure, that cost center that goes back against the business. How can we transition items to online and save some money? But I want to stay away from that one because it is the one probably your leadership's going to ask about. But it really comes down to, I think, a greater access and a better experience. I'm going to blend 2 and 3 for you. And the reason why I think that's the case is right now, I'm going to use COVID and the lockdown as this is there isn't any ILT. So you're able to actually go through and identify your objective right now of we want to give them access to content, which is better, greater access, but also give them a better experience. Right now, they're not being trained. And that's something that you really want to be able to kind of approach well. The other thing is you're able to actually interact digitally when you move content online and have constant follow-ups and constant engagement after the fact, after you deliver content. So it helps giving them a better experience and allowing the kind of education to land over a period of time rather than just kind of in the moment.
Yeah, I think the financial one is probably like the no-brainer, right? If you can put the dollar argument in there, your leadership's going to be far more approving of that approach. And I think that kind of goes without saying. I'm going to go for the one that lets me nerd out and kind of my passion. That's the last one. That's the greater insights and analytics around what you're doing. We'll keep saying it. I'm a nerd by heart, self-proclaimed. I love data. I love reporting. I love analytics. I think that what you can do with the information you're getting from those classes now being in a place where you're recording sessions, you're recording interactions, you're recording quiz scores, you're just getting a more rich environment. And while I love the data part of it and getting to build charts and all that stuff in Excel, the real story and why it's a benefit to you is that you actually can make change from that, right? You're going to be able to sell that back to your leaders. and you're going to be able to make improvements to your training to impact things like experience. So I think that ties back that you're going to be able to make more and more adjustments to get more fine-tuned and really help your learners approach it in a better way.
One thing that I want to address with that, Scott, too, is that when you're identifying your objectives, I think we've said this before, is there's two sets of objectives you have to kind of adhere to. The first is the organizational objectives, but the second is the objectives of your employees or your audience. And better talent development, personalized learning, those sorts of things are important to the modern learner, the modern employee that you have. It's what people are asking for. And when you have greater insights, you could also provide a better experience to the learner. It's not just about holding them accountable and making sure that they're actually engaged with information. All of those things, greater access, better experience, greater insights, help the learner have a better talent development or a learning process with your organization. I think that's a big part of identifying your objectives.
And greater insight also, like from a learning and development perspective, you have to approach it with the notion that a little humility and say, we may not be getting it right every time, right? I think that's, if you're not willing to come with a bit of an open mind, saying there's things to be learned and there's change to be had, those insights won't help you, right? If you think you've produced it and you're not willing to say we can get better, all of the insights in the world won't really help you get a better experience or a better product on out to the field or out to your learners. So I think that's really important too. Come with open mind around change and be willing to kind of keep bettering and keep moving forward. I think most L&D wants that, but just it's always a reminder that failure or opportunity in some of the data isn't a reflection of poor construction or poor process. It's just, it needs to be refined. It needs to be better. Sometimes we don't quite hit the mark, or we don't maybe miss on a topic, and that's okay. You just got to keep working towards getting it better and better all the time.
So Scott, I don't think that everybody really potentially fits into those four objectives. So what other objectives kind of have you heard out there, or have you come across that may relate to some other, of our listeners?
Yeah, obviously I think every business is a little different. Everybody's kind of got their own circumstance or scenario that they're working through. And so, while we gave four maybe key or ones that we see as really important, yeah, companies are going to come with their own. One of the ones I see quite a bit is what I like to call keeping up with the Joneses. And it's the notion that technology is changing. There's always these shiny new objects, VR, AR, whatever it might be, that's out in the world. And a lot of people just say their objective is they just want the new toy, or they just want to keep up. And progress for the sake of progress is maybe not the right objective, but I think that the motivation behind being forward thinking is a good approach. I don't think that's a bad thing. You just not want to be really strategic around, try not to, I'm going to use all kinds of cliches in my discussion here, but trying to fit the square peg into the round hole.
Mm-hmm.
Don't make it fit just because it's there. Make sure it's strategic. Make sure it makes sense. Because I think if it doesn't, if it feels a bit shoehorned into your approach, your learners are going to see that, and they're going to kind of put up barriers to making that a thing. But if you can really find a good approach for it, I'm not opposed to staying on top of technology just for the sake of staying on top of technology.
Yeah, I mean, keeping up with the Joneses is funny. We had a client partner probably about 3 years ago. They've changed their perspective quite a bit since then, but where they were, every call we had was just like, so what do you got new? What do you have that's new? What do you have that's new? And like, they had by no means had adapted or implemented effectively or executed any strategy or technology that was put into place. But it was always like, what's new? What's new? And I love the idea of dreaming big and whittling down and dreaming big and whittling down. But at some point, you need to implement what's been whittled down and make sure that that's effective and move on. But keeping a healthy pulse on R&D is not a bad idea at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've got to have that good foundation. And I think in a very similar way, another objective that I see from a number of clients is they just need change, right? Maybe they've been stagnant for a really long time, and they've kind of become status quo with their content, and they recognize there's a need for change. And so they're jumping into these waters because this is what they think is right. And that's another side of it. They're not necessarily trying to keep up with someone else. They just recognize that they've lagged behind organizationally, technologically, whatever that might be. And so I think we need to make sure that when you're looking at that format, really, again, be strategic, make sure you're picking the right step forward, and don't try to take it all at once. I think that's part of it as well. So just another side of that kind of same coin, I think. The last one, and that I can kind of think of off the top of my head, is just different objectives or different KPIs, if you will. So better onboarding or reducing your early turnover might be an objective. Those are probably a bit more strategic. They're probably still aligned to things like financial benefit in a lot of ways, because reducing turnover obviously reduces some cost for onboarding. You may be thinking about it in different terms, and that's all right. You need to be specific to what your circumstances are. I think there are a lot of other ways to define sort of your objectives.
Yeah, I think better onboarding, reduce early turnover is what I would consider to be a micro objective, or very like segmented. So you may have your macro objectives, and then that falls into a specific category that are things you need to achieve, kind of in that category. But yeah, it's definitely something that we hear leadership comes down to the L&D department and says like, we need better onboarding and we got to reduce our turnover, and here we are. So.
And
Sure.
we've talked about it in others that you might have to rethink other episodes. You might have to rethink your ROI, right? And things like reducing turnover is another way to look at the way you're going to calculate that. So I think those kind of instances really help. All right, you have come up with your objectives. You've thought about why this is important. What are the benefits to your company? Now it's kind of time to start looking at the content itself. What is the right program? What is the right training? What is the right learning moment that needs to be transitioned to online? So these are typically going to be things like instructor-led classes or coaching opportunities that are more scheduled. Now we want to put them more into a self-paced environment or a digitally produced environment, or in the case of COVID, we're talking a lot about virtual delivery, right? So it could even be those as moments. There's a lot of ways to approach this. But what's the right content to move? I think that becomes a bit debatable on what your library of content programs look like. But so we kind of want to just talk through maybe 3 ways to look at it, I think, today, as you determine what's right for your organization. I'm going to start with the low-hanging fruit. I call these the path of least resistance. Some content is just what I like to call right for the picking, right? To keep the pun going with the low-hanging fruit. This is it's a term called didactic learning for those that aren't familiar, but it's basically, this is all about the purpose of conveying information. So lecture style classroom environments that are maybe a little less interactive. They're really just for pushing conversation out or that dialogue out, that information. Classrooms typically have low engagement in these environments. There's not a lot of interaction. There's not a lot of user engagement. Sometimes these are old programs, but you're looking for opportunities to potentially maybe produce video out of this, YouTube-style instructional videos, build interaction through e-learning. Maybe it's scenario-driven or situational, putting in game elements, or maybe it's just simply job aids, right? So sometimes when it's informational, it's just documents. So there's a lot of modality options there. We'll talk about that more too, but this is just the stuff that really is all about getting information out.
I think one of the things that the approaches you can take in this regard is to actually speak to your audience, and that's going to be something that you want to do through kind of each of these steps or each of these process points. But speak to your audience, because getting feedback about content that they've taken in person, I know that I've had some meetings where we have a meeting and then afterwards we talk. I may talk to the person who's running the meeting, and we agree that it probably just could have been an email or a message or whatever. And that's kind of a different example of the same thing of being able to take something online that doesn't necessarily need to be in the classroom because it's costly or whatever. So I think speak to the people who've attended. They may turn to you and say, we could have just taken an e-learning on that. It would have been more effective. I can also use it as a reference point after the fact. So speaking to your audience will help you identify those low-hanging fruit kind of as your first step, or some really old programs that people are just bored with. I think making sure you speak to your audience and getting their opinion is super important with that.
Yeah, and again, hopefully you're getting some of that in whatever format you can today. Again, you'll get more insight from your learners, as we talked about, as you go more online. But this is really just, you're trying to find those opportunities. Now, again, if your objective is things like a better experience or a differentiated experience, just-in-time training, these content items that are all about just pushing information, talking through a process, but not really practicing, whatever that might be. These are often shorter classes. Look for those opportunities to put things in people's hand, like instructional videos, where they can pull these up on demand. They're very small, they're consumable, and they help them in the moment of need. those kind of opportunities are a win on both sides, right? You might reduce some cost in training for financial, but you might also give people a differentiated experience that lets them get better on the job training when they need it. So think about that when you're talking about those path of least resistance, I think. Obviously, the other side of that coin is what I call biggest bang for the buck. So these are, where am I going to see the greatest reduction in my cost, or where am I going to see the biggest increase in my user engagement? And these are often your high visibility programs. These are going to be wildly accepted programs. Typically, you can look for ways to either maybe reduce the time in class. You can help with change management in these cases because people are already more accepting of those programs. They're already excited to go to them. We're going to just increase the experience. These often, though, come with the highest spend in terms of transitioning, right? You're going to have to change a lot about these programs to get them into place, but you may also see the greatest reduction in cost. So think about that when you're thinking about what is your most common class that you're producing. Is that something that has the opportunity to, again, we talked about not eliminating the current experience altogether, but how do you transition some of it off and maybe reduce some of that effort?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of, you see some organizations, whether they have within your first 90 days, you have to go to a 3 or 4 day instructor led course, huge cost there. I don't think we're saying that you need to take that whole process online, because there's a lot of things that, yeah, depending on what industry you're in, it's going to happen in person. But you could potentially shorten it to 2 days, make it feel less like a chore for the employee, save the organization some money, and also be able to deliver more content in an online fashion that they can use as reference material after the fact. So there are definitely some big visibility perspectives, but also I'll use the example of, like, whether it's onboarding or whether it's a big program like that. There's always it's your first opportunity to make an impact with the learner, and delivering them the content the way they are most comfortable engaging with it is a great way to make a really positive impact with your content. So moving it online, knowing what type of learner you have, can help in kind of amplifying that biggest bang for your buck scenario.
That piece to me is really important. We're talking about the big bang for the buck. If these are really accepted, generally popular programs that you're just trying to make tweaks to, this is a great opportunity to help people start to have that change management component where they start to think about blended learning, online learning, especially if they haven't had a lot of interaction with it. This is your first chance to really sell them on the notion that this is valuable to them as a learner, and they're probably going to have a greater acceptance rate on these elements because there's already some energy around that program. I think that really helps too. Our last kind of one that I want to bring up that I always think of when I'm evaluating this is it applies back to when we talk about other objectives. We talked about like the need to change. What are your weakest programs? So if you are doing evaluation on some of these, are there programs that are old? Are they outdated? They've just been around and this is sort of the way they are all the time, right? They've been this way for so long. Are you looking at evaluating some of those because of a need to change? And that might be the sole reason for making that the one you choose as a program that needs to change because it feels out of date. And I think those are opportunities as well.
Just to comment on that a little bit too, there's some programs that are staples or have been around for a long time, especially at large organizations where they have everybody at a single campus. There's no real travel costs for the in-person training, but it's this thing or this notion of like, oh, you can always go sign up for that course and go take it over lunch for a lunch and learn. And that may be completely irrelevant. It may be more effective to have that employee be able to go and take an online training or engage in a one-on-one or something about that virtually. So I think when you look at those weakest programs, they may be things that you believe are just staples of your organization, but actually they're just noise. And they're not really delivering the results that you want to see.
With that in mind, I have a really, from our past life, an example of these weakest programs. We had a very standardized program that was really popular, actually. A lot of attendance, pretty good reviews, staple of the organization, like you mentioned. But when you talk about listening to your learners, we got feedback from someone who'd been at a class, and it had an introduction video in the class itself that kind of welcomed you to the session. And we got feedback saying, like, your video's wrong. And the reality was, it said something like, you've been in business for 85 years, or, we've been doing this for 85 years. And the user's like, except if you do the math, you've actually been in business for 97 years or whatever the number was. And we had to look at it and go, wow, no one's touched that video in 12 years. Like, it was a really nicely put together marketing video, but we hadn't updated the actual content assets, at least for 12 years in that program. And it was a staple. It was something we were using, but that's an opportunity to go back and go, okay, we got to do this. If we're going to be in there redoing some videos and some assets anyway, let's look at it and see if it's got an opportunity to be updated.
So now that you've really decided what content, or you've at least got an idea of what content could go online, your next step's really to figure out what's the right modality for your organization and your learners. And a great way to start is by asking these two questions. What are the modalities that I can choose from? And how are your learners interested in engaging with the content? So a good example of that, I guess, just to start and give a nice blanket of what modalities, encompass online learning. You have microlearning, you have videos, you have e-learnings, which are all self-paced options. And you could even throw podcasts in there. Obviously, we're recording one now, but they're becoming more and more popular in learning, being on learning management systems and things like that. And then you have your transition online for instructor-led, which is VILT, virtual instructor-led training, which is another modality as well. So the biggest, I think, misconception, or I guess differentiating opinions that we see with modalities is when we're talking about moving online, we're not talking about, instructor-led to self-paced. Moving to a virtual instructor-led training or a connected classroom experience is still moving your training online, and you're still able to hit on the objectives. So you really have to just evaluate what the best modality is across kind of the ones we mentioned, or maybe there's others as well that you may be interested in or kind of pop up on your side of things, whether they're just, infographics or simple job aids, like Scott mentioned earlier, that can go online to make the optimal learning experience, learning process, journey for your employees based on your objectives. Scott, anything you're kind of seeing around modalities that interest you?
Yeah, one of the things that I think I'll add in this is all a topic around blended learning too, right? So we're not just talking about taking your content and shifting it digitally, but this is about trying to mix modalities to some degree. So you're probably not going to land on just e-learning or just video as a solution. You're probably saying, I want to dabble a little bit in all of this to try to create that more varied experience for your learners. So keep that in mind as well. It's not just picking one and sticking with it. I think you can use this to find ways to support and go forward. I'm actually really intrigued. So obviously, Daniel and I have a passion around learning, and it caused us to want to start a podcast. I'm actually hearing that more and more from organizations that they think podcasting is a really great way to kind of communicate. And if I'm just going to provide a couple things that I think are really important around, if that is something you're interested in doing as an organization, there are a few things that I think are important. I understand the irony of about what I'm about to say as we took a week off, but consistency of delivery is important. I think you need to make sure you're ready to produce something at least on some kind of a consistent rhythm. Now, we chose weekly as our delivery time. Maybe it's monthly for you. Maybe it's a monthly recap, and so it's a little bit more spread out, so it's not as intense. Because the reality is, you're probably not going to have somebody who podcasts full time for your company. This is going to be something that you do as a side hustle to your day job in a lot of ways, especially as you start out. So keep that in mind, that find a rhythm that you think will work well, that your employees can start to expect, because if you start to get into a rhythm and then you kind of pause and go away from it, you have the potential to lose some users. The other thing that I think is a real struggle point for a lot of companies, and I did this as well, you can get caught in the Google rabbit hole that is, what does my podcast need to get off the ground from equipment and everything else? And man, you can read 1,000 different blog posts that are going to tell you to buy 1,000 different microphones, 1,000 different pop filters and soundboards and everything else. And truthfully, like Daniel and I have learned, the best thing to do is just get started. And if you've got to record on a computer microphone for the time being, it's something. It's a place to start. And if it builds in momentum and you get some value from it, then you can keep upgrading your equipment over time. I think that's you can buy some wacky sound elements and things. You can buy your transition pieces.
Yep.
But keep that in mind. Lastly, from a podcast perspective, I think you can mix some of what we've talked about from a micro learning perspective. I mean, obviously, our target is, keep it 30, 45 minutes, whatever our podcast tends to be. Maybe your podcast is more what we call, I think Daniel referenced it in a conversation earlier that he and I were having, where he's calling micro podcasts, right? Maybe your podcast is 5 or 10 minutes long and that's all it is. So you're not forcing a long seat time for a lot of people. And maybe with that, you do more frequent podcasts as well. Maybe you decide twice a week is the rhythm for you, but they're just 5-minute little moments. I think those are great things.
I think on everything you're talking about, I'm glad you got to dove into podcasts because it's something that's important, right? It's going back to the concept of engaging with your learners, how they want to learn or take in information. And if you have a lecture style ILT, which is really, there's not a lot of interaction, it's very much a lecture style. If you had that expert, your subject matter expert, produce a podcast on that topic, you're now allowing your employee to engage with that content voluntarily while they're doing yard work, while they're going for a walk, when they're getting ready to go to work or go to their remote workstation right now, going for a run. Like, you're now reaching your learner from a voluntary basis in places you couldn't reach them before. Which, going back to what we started about, is like greater access, just in time training. We're hearing the trend that the employee in 2020, the learner in 2020 wants to engage with content. They want to progress. So if your organization's putting out content the way they are used to engaging with content, I think it's a huge proponent. And that's why podcasts, I think, are going to make a big push in the L&D space. We're hearing it from a lot of our partners now as something that's super important. So like I said, it's all about the optimal learning experience based upon the objectives for the learner.
You mentioned too that you're talking about things like yard work or driving into the office or whatever that might be. Some organizations aren't really comfortable with pushing that content outside of the office, but think about all the times your employees have task-oriented items. So if you're in a retail and store environment, as an example, your merchandising team, your inventory team, a lot of times they're just listening to the radio or Pandora or whatever it is anyway. What if they could throw a podcast on while they're pushing boxes or stocking shelves? If your employees are on the sales floor and they're doing cleaning, right, or they're getting the department ready in the morning, whatever that might be, those are opportunities where they can pop on a 5-minute podcast. They're going to be probably listening to music anyway. They're going to be doing something. Why not let them learn in that moment? I think those are really cool opportunities to take what might be downtime for a lot of folks where they can't be at a computer anyway, but give them another way to consume content. So it's another way to reach people, and I like that we're experimenting in that space.
Yeah, and I mean, we're very much down that rabbit hole, but I think I just want to kind of go back to the senses, like, there are a variety of different modalities, and when it comes down to it, there's a variety of different modalities that you can choose from, and like we said, microlearning, different e-learnings, VILTs, and podcasts. So you really want to go back to what's correct for the learner, and that's really important. But part of that whole process is the change, like we said, from what content's going online. You have your modality, and it's not easy to go through it. It's very easy to get into a rabbit hole of like, I think this is the best way. This is how we should move our learning online. So consulting outside sources is something that can be super helpful. The easiest form that we could throw out there is, working with an L&D agency or your L&D agency, consulting other leaders in your organization to get feedback on how you could move content online. But one of the things that I think Scott and I both use pretty frequently is, obviously lots of virtual conference going around, but even just sending people a LinkedIn message. You see somebody who works in your industry or works in L&D in a different industry because you may want a different perspective, shooting them a message. I would say pretty much everyone we reach out to chat with are really interested in helping out, providing feedback, providing experience of what's going on. So I think it's something where, like, hey, reaching out to outside sources. It doesn't have to be a hired outside source, just can be someone in the industry, is super important.
I think that's happening more and more. And virtual conferences right now, just that is a wealth of information. They're starting to pop up everywhere. A lot of them are free. So take that opportunity if you can and spend some time meeting some new people, getting some new perspectives, or just listening to even some of the sessions, because sometimes that'll help too. So.
Are you taking the time to kind of understand what content you're moving online, what modality is right for you and your organization? But now it's about getting that content developed. And truth of the matter is, the proof is in the pudding. And I got told this morning that I guess I say proof is in the pudding a lot, but
sometimes
we have the Mendoza line over here, and we got proof in the pudding over here. So now I guess I'm getting phrases that I like to use. But when taking content online and implementing change, first impressions are everything. So when you're changing and going through the change management process, and asking a learner to kind of hop into a new strategy or hop into a new approach to learning within your organization, how you work with them right off the bat, or how you interact with them is super important. So your first impression is everything. You need to be able to make an impact with them right off the bat. So it helps with building a culture of learning within your organization. It helps with the transition of consistently learning, being encouraged to have greater access to content and those items as well. So it's very important to make sure that you make a good first impression.
What people see the first time they're out is going to set the tone for how well they're ready to accept what you're pitching as a new way of doing business, a new way of pushing training out to them. If it lands a little flat, that will impact whether or not you're going to be successful in all your future endeavors. I think you need to go big on those, make it look right. We've talked about the importance of UI, UX in other episodes. I think all of those are elements that I think are really valuable to a learner. And if you get energy around it, man, that will steamroll. That's the reality. And all of this is, once people build energy, they're going to start asking you to do more and more of this if you get it right up front. I think that's really important to focus on that.
I think the balance is there. Like, I think there's some really talented people. I'm just going to use content development in general, not necessarily learning. Some really talented people who, music artists, like all those sorts of things, who, if you think about music artists, think about how much music probably is just sitting in a vault because they never wanted to put it out there. They may have some gems in there because your audience is still the best evaluator of what you're putting out there. So I think it's a nice balance of making sure you get it right and you're able to make a good first impression, but not overproducing or overthinking, because at the end of the day, you're probably more critical of yourself or the content you're putting out there than your audience will be. So it's about finding that balance, and maybe also finding a focus group who you can talk to about your content, so you get a different perspective.
And let's be honest, there is a fine line too between really robust, really interesting, really important first impression, right? Where you're really going at it to try to make this fun, and what I'll call the cheese factor. You can cross the line between high quality, really impactful, interesting, and go to way too much overproduction, to your point, where you almost make it cheesy, right? And it comes off in the wrong way. So
yeah, just some quick notes just on the right approach. There's different models out there. We develop primarily when we work with our clients in the ADDIE method, obviously, analyzing what we want to do, designing, developing, implementing, evaluating. So, and making sure that every time we go through that process, we're able to check back to one of those points and make sure that we continue to move forward, or answering the necessary questions that we need to answer. We're not just going in with blinders on in a funnel to develop content. And that goes kind of on my next point is, if you don't have the expertise within your organization and you're making a transition, it is important to potentially hire that expertise, because it's not a little transition. You don't have to know everything, and finding a partner that can help you with the transition is a good idea. It may be for, a short period of time, just come in, evaluate it for me, maybe consult for a little bit, or it could be very well that you need a partner to help you develop content. But if the expertise doesn't live in house, getting a subscription to Articulate and you don't have any creative ability, or you've never been an instructional designer, not necessarily your best route. So it's good to make sure you kind of approach the environment as a whole.
I think you can even expand on that a touch more. There's obviously a lot in that ADDIE method in terms of where all the touch points are. And maybe you've got the instructional design or the writing potential because you've done a lot of it for your classes, but it's in the use of the software to author a tool, or the creative in terms of making imaging and content. Maybe your marketing team doesn't have the bandwidth to assist in creating some visuals for you. You don't have to do everything, so don't feel like you have to take it all on yourself. There are a lot of companies out there that can help you in whatever your point is. So maybe you've got the really strong creative, but you need help in the writing. There's companies that will help you with that. Obviously, Daniel and I work for a company that does a lot of this as well. Ultimately, our goal is to help you find better content. So wherever you can't make it through, don't feel like that has to be a pain point. Try to help yourself find those experts. And to Daniel's point, maybe it's something to get you along the first leg of the journey till you can build your muscle and start to get that as a part of your organization. That's an option too. So,
and just one more comment on choosing a partner, because one of the things that I always is probably, like I said, I mentioned I'm in the sales and marketing side of the business. So one of the things that I find is always interesting is the first look of a potential client or partner's face when we tell them not to do something with us. Like, you know what, we actually don't need to do that, so let's not do that. And they're like, whoa, because they think we're just in there to sell. Find yourself a partner that is honest and transparent and is willing to not just say, when you say like, we need to change this content, just take it on board and change it. They're actually able to give you an evaluation of if it needs to be changed or not.
All right. Speaking of change, obviously all of this is about transition. And with that comes change management. And what is your communication? How do you approach reaching out to your audience and saying, hey, we're going to try something new. We're going to go a little bit off the beaten path of history, but we think it's really valuable. And obviously, you've got to sell that message. You've got to be able to get that out there. So we want to talk through a couple ideas on how do you set up for change management now that you've designed, you've figured out your objectives, all of these components have kind of come into play. You're ready to go. You're ready to implement, but you got to have that buy-in from your team. So the first place you start is I think you have to communicate the why. And this is to leaders, this is to learners, this is to your teams that are developing, all of this, the people are going to be delivering. Why are you doing this? And that all speaks back to those objectives. Make sure you're landing what this does for them, why it's important to your organization, why are you doing this? And I think that helps at least set them in the right frame of mind. With that comes selling it as a win for the audience. Why is it for them? Is it less stress? Is it less time in class? Is it more control? There's a lot of ways that can tie into what a learner is going to be able to do. Put on your marketing cap. This is different for L&D in some ways. Some of us are very experienced with it, or we've had to do it a lot. Sell yourself. Build the energy around your program. I think that's not always our favorite thing to have to do, to sell why you're doing what you're doing, but sometimes you have to. And then communicate frequently about available classes, the change in the format. Be really transparent with what's happening. I think that's important too. The other side of this, we talked about user experience, and give your learners the opportunity to practice. Let them find the thing that's good for them, right? So some of this isn't about forcing it into their lap and saying this is what you have to do, but let them actually explore. Let them get experience with it and see that it's not scary, right? It's not, there's no reason to be fearful of the change. Let it happen. And then communicate after the event, follow up, do surveys, get that information. You've got that access to data and insights. We talked about that from an objective. Utilize that, get information back from your learners, provide recognition and accountability for post-class work. There's ways to do both those in a really nice balance.
Yeah, I think that everything you said, Scott, makes so much sense. Change is hard. And I think, and it's usually met with resistance. I use an example. So in Canada, we have, a coffee place called Tim Hortons. I'm not sure everybody knows what Tim Hortons is, but it's basically Dunkin' Donuts, for Canada, although I'm sure there's some Tim Hortons lovers that just got offended. But a new Tim Hortons is built and nobody goes to it because they don't want to change their routine, is what the point I was trying to make there. But the point is, change is hard. So the why, I think, is so important. It helps people loosen up a little bit, but also just constantly communicating with them that, and having a little bit of empathy and a little bit, you're trying to build a culture of learning, and being sympathetic or empathetic to them about the change being hard is a really positive way to approach it. You want to get away from, part of moving online and the blended experience is moving away from required and creating more recommended or voluntary training. I think that how you approach change is going to set the tone for making people to want to engage with learning on their own time, and continuously improve themselves throughout your organization.
All right. Lastly, I think we want to spend some time today talking you through a few do's and don'ts. Let's recap a little bit of what we talked about. Obviously, we've kind of covered the breadth of what it is to get your blended learning approach off the ground, get yourself into a digital space. How do we get you out of the analog world into the digital world? But there's a few do's and don'ts that I think we've always come across as we talk with clients and just experiences told us. So we're going to cover a few do's. My first one is the golden rule. Treat your business partners, all the people that you're going to be working with, treat them the same way you wish they would treat you, right? So this goes back to elementary school for a lot of us. This was the first thing we learned. Treat others as you'd like to be treated. Engage your business teams, gather insights, make sure everybody's represented that needs to be a part of that conversation. Because the reality is they're going to become your advocates when they know this is affecting their programs or it's affecting their success rates. You're just going to build allies. So make sure you're bringing those folks along so that you're getting their insights as you go down this journey of changing the culture of your learning.
Another do, experiment. Try lots of different things. So try different ways of delivering content, learn lessons, analyze it after the fact, and don't be afraid to fail. we said first impressions are everything, but also the transparency around something not working necessarily as well as you thought it would is super important to taking the next step up the ladder of improving your L&D and creating a culture of learning. So try different ways of delivering content.
Our next do is to shop around a little. And by that, we mean don't get married to the first thing you try. We mentioned it a little bit. We mentioned the pitfalls of keeping up with the Joneses, but sometimes it is about always thinking ahead and trying to come up with a way to improve that. Use those insights to gather information to help you revise, help you edit, or maybe just say, you know what, we want to add more to this, and that's a good approach. But don't just think because you changed once, that's the end of it. Change is a progression, change is an evolution. It's going to happen over time. Find out what's right for your organization.
And our last do is explore outside of your comfort zone when you're trying to make a change. I had a coach in my life that used to tell me that success lies just right outside of your comfort zone. So a lot of times when we're speaking to customers, and clients, we hear, well, everybody is used to this and they like it. Just because something's going well doesn't mean it can't be better. So get outside of your comfort zone a little bit, explore, and try to make a change because you may find more options when you just step outside a little bit.
Yeah, and if we're using great sayings that we love in this space, I also had a mentor in my life that once told me there's no growth in the comfort zone and there's no comfort in the growth zone. And I think if you take that approach, you're going to build better stuff if you kind of step outside of that comfort zone. All right, with that comes the other side of the coin is there's also some don'ts, right? So we've told you some things that you really need to focus and make sure you implement and do. There's also some stuff you should try to avoid and not go down that path. The first thing I'll advise is we mentioned, don't try to take it all on at once. Don't try to change everything for everyone at one time. We talked about change is hard. It becomes really hard when it's overwhelming and it's too much at one time. Figure out what's the right stepped approach to get this going. You're not going to change all of your instructor-led classes to this blended environment of a mix of everything all at one time. Be strategic, start to roll this out, build some momentum around it, and I think you're going to find better success.
The next note on the list is don't exceed what your organization can support from an infrastructure and IT perspective. This one happens a lot, and we continuously always ask the question very early in any process that we're involved with of, well, how much bandwidth do you have at the locations where training will be taken? Though, are you allowed to have devices on your work floor? Those sorts of things. And typically 4K video doesn't play well in low bandwidth environments. So that's just an example, but there's also other sort of technology, whether it's machines that are being worked on, iOS updates on store iPads, et cetera, that can cause you problems. Make sure you engage IT and you understand the infrastructure you're working with before you really try to push in a modernized direction.
And the last one is one that it's been the bane of my existence for all of my time in L&D, but in your organization, don't get caught in the we've always done it this way trap. It speaks a bit to even the infrastructure stuff. Sometimes that is reality and those are insurmountable odds, but sometimes someone will tell you it can't happen because they've always just believed that to be true. Challenge some of those notions so that you don't get caught in no one will ever change because this is the way we've always done it. Always find a way to combat that because the reality is rarely that it can't be done differently. It's just that people have kind of built up in their mind this conception that it shouldn't go differently, and don't get caught in that trap.
Come on, get happy.
All right. We wrap up every show with a positive moment from the life of Daniel and myself, something we're seeing in the world that brings us some energy or some joy. Today is no different. As we know, we took a week off. I did go out into the wilderness. I was up in northern Wisconsin, in the woods, on a lake, visiting my family. Honestly, my positivity point was in this crazy world where we've all isolated and we're staying quarantined, we're doing the right things. It was nice to have a change of scenery. To see different walls every day was kind of nice. To have different interactions. All of these were nice things. Now, I will say, with all of that in mind, we also took strategic steps. I don't want to make it sound like we just traveled for travel's sake. We were pretty safe about how we did it. We made sure we were isolated first. We traveled the right way. We did it safely. But it was just great to get away, see something different, experience something different, let the kids see it a little different and obviously see their grandparents was a huge win for us too. Baseball season is about to kick off, and we knew getting away during the summer was going to become hard for us. So for me, it was relaxing, it was refreshing, it was something we all needed, and I think we're back and ready to go. So
I'll stay on that trend initially, Scott. I think just golf courses opened up in Ontario, which is nice, and it's probably during the summer one of the zen moments I get for myself. I was able to hit the links and get some swings in. Didn't go as well as I would have liked it to, but was nice to get out there and play. And I have to say that everybody's really respectful out in the golf course of any sort of social distancing or approaches they need to take. So it was nice to be out there. But on that note, I wanted to kind of add one more positivity point in that just kind of, I'll be honest, just kind of popped in my head. It's something I try to do at least once a quarter personally. I try to always reach out to somebody I haven't spoken to in a little while and just say hello, ask how they're doing, and make sure they know that if they need anything, I'm always here. And I think that there's been a lot of crazy, wild stuff going on, especially in the past week outside of the pandemic that's going on as well. And I think it's a great time to just reach out to somebody you care about, somebody you know well, say hi, and make sure they're doing okay. So maybe that's a challenge for everyone this week, is just to reach out to somebody you care about and say hello and see how they're doing.
I love it. All right, that'll do it for us today. Thanks again. I'm Scott Babcock. He's Daniel Mendonca, and we will talk to you next week, this time for real.
See you later, everybody.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Join the conversation by emailing podcast@haylight.com or on social media platforms at Haylight Inc. And be sure to check us out on the web at www.haylight.com. That's HALIGHT.com.